Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome to Tech Leaders Hub, episode number 11. My guest today is Adam Craven. Adam, how are you doing today?
Jacob, I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm super excited about today's session. I'm actually quite giddy today. I don't know the reason, but I'm always giddy on the days when we have Tech Leaders Hub, so that might be part of the reason. That is great that you could make it here. And as always, I mean, if you're seeing, or listening to this for like the third, fourth, fifth, seventh time, you know what I'm going to say. Let us know that this is working correctly. Please leave a comment that you can see us and you can hear us. That is the most important thing, because if you can't see us and you can't hear us, then you can't get the valuable content that we've got for you and the tips from Adam that we've got for you today. So do let us know. And people are going to take at least a few minutes to still kind of trickle in, join our session. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay. So while we're waiting, Adam, I wanted to ask you, who do you hope is tuning in? Who do you imagine listening to our conversation, and what will they get from it?
Yeah, well, the people who are going to get most out of this are people who think of themselves as leaders. And that doesn't have to be the traditional leader. You don't have to be running a team. You could be someone who cares a lot about software engineering, cares a lot about being a CTO, all a range of people, but just people who care, really. People who care about software engineering and making software engineering better for everyone and for their teams. So those are the sort of people I think will get a lot out of it. And I really hope to speak to you today.
Yeah, exactly. And from our preliminary conversation, I think if you're listening to this and you're not in software engineering, but you're leading a team, you can still get some value from it. Some of these principles can be applied more universally, but that's just my take on what we've been discussing a little bit before the session. Anyway, Gareth is here with a comment saying that he can hear and see us loud and clear. It's great that you can also see us. A lot of people just have it in the background when they're kind of ironing or working. If somebody's watching actively, thanks for that. Thank you for that. And just to reward the people who joined in very, very quickly, I do want to provide value up front. It is my tradition to ask you this one question that quite a few people have already answered. And that question is, what is your number one tip for tech leaders? What would you say, Adam?
My number one tip for tech leaders is to bring your teams into alignment. So what does that look like? A team that is not aligned is, you imagine it by two people holding a tug of war rope, so a long, thick rope. And those two people are either ends of the rope and they're pulling against each other. And they're causing stress. They're basically getting nowhere. Compared to an aligned team, which is two people holding a rope on either end and walking off in the same direction. Sure, they'll occasionally get hit by an obstacle, like they might get wrapped around a tree, or they might want to go off in a slightly different direction from now and again, but they're always going for the same goal, to aim towards the same thing. So that's what an aligned team is about. And aligned teams obviously produce more code. They are happier teams. But in tech, that isn't always visible. You can't see inside the minds of people. You can't see when people are checked out. It's kind of like an invisible wall of lack of alignment, especially if you're leading teams, not being able to see what's going on inside the team and the invisible behavior that's happening. So principles. And how do you align teams? Well, principles align teams, and we're definitely going to be talking more about that today.
Okay, so I guess the tip boils down to pay attention to alignment, and principles is one way to get there. That's great. That's what we'll be talking about today. Software engineering principles is the goal of this conversation, and the topic will be revolving around. It's actually quite an interesting story how this came about, because the origin of our conversation is, I think we saw you on HackerNews, like a lot of people also did. So can you tell us a little bit about what's been happening in the recent weeks in terms of your project principles.dev landing on HackerNews and how that went?
Yes, so it appearing on HackerNews was a complete mistake. Well, a complete surprise, should I say. I didn't expect to go on HackerNews, and it got to the front page of HackerNews. It was in the top few stories for a long time. and I got 60,000 people visiting the website. Now,
Wow.
thankfully, when I started the website at the very beginning, from a technical perspective, I thought, okay, I need to design this to last for HackerNews. So I did a performance testing and said, okay, this should last a HackerNews thing. And thankfully, the site was fine; it had no problems. So that was from a technical perspective was great. But the site wasn't quite ready at the time. It wasn't ready to take on people. But it's been an amazing experience, because from that, I've got job offers. People are speaking to me about it and saying, "Hey, Adam, yeah, this is really interesting. This is the problem that I'm having. Can I talk to you more about it?" So it was an unexpected thing, and it's from that. It's kind of this has obviously come from this, and it's been great to talk to people. I think this is a project, my own personal project, I've been working on for some time, and getting such a large audience and such a wide amount of feedback has kind of gone, yeah, there's a real desire for this, there's a real need for it. And so it's been very exciting. It's kind of gone, oh my God, there's all this stuff that I've got to do now. But it's also gone, and I've also gone, okay, well, I thought I should do this, but now I've got to do this. So having the feedback has been incredible. And yeah, so it's been an amazing experience.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So I was thinking we might start our conversation by talking about what led you up to this point, because one image that comes to my mind is this. A lot of people talk about overnight success, right? That people have this what seems to be like an overnight success. Something blows up just from one day to another. You land, for example, on the front page of HackerNews, but there is no such thing as overnight success, right? It stems from many years of work, many years of exploring, of putting ideas together. So I was wondering if landing on the first page of HackerNews was your tip of the iceberg here. What is underneath? What is your story so far that led you to start principles.dev?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely right with what you say about that. When you see things appearing on HackerNews, that's because I'd personally done years and years of work on this subject, and that started like 15 years ago when I first started my career as a software engineer. Briefly, I worked for BBC iPlayer, Nokia, HSBC, McKinsey, and I've had positions from tech lead, engineer, CTO, and consultant. And I think the thing where it all started for me was a desire to make software engineering better, and also to make myself better. And I remember when I first started in my career, I actually had another career before that. I was working as an electrical engineer, but I remember going to college as an electrical engineer, and I'd have underneath the desk the books out on how to do web development. So while the class was teaching electrical engineering, I was reading about how to do web development. So I realized I'd quite quickly chosen the wrong career. And my heart was in web development. And when I joined, I didn't realize I could get paid for web development, actually. I thought I loved it so much. And I saw one of my friends sent a job spec out for a job in London. I was like, I can get paid for doing this. I was really surprised by it, because I absolutely loved the job. And the first few parts of my career was really about upskilling myself. And it was kind of a more insular way of working. I think sometimes when you're a junior, you're kind of doing your stuff and you're doing it in your own little box and you're developing things. And as I went through my career, I started working with other people's code. Now, if you're a software engineer, probably the worst thing in the world is often regarded as other people's code. And I really wanted to know why that was the case. Why was it so bad? Why did somebody have such different ways of doing things compared to me? Like, what was the logic behind it? And I remember asking these questions and say, well, why do you do it like this? And they go X, Y, Z, and the reasons weren't very compelling for me. So I was always fascinated by the differences in the way people approach programming. And I think people would say about me, probably 3 traits that are quite obvious is I'm a big picture thinker. I'm really good with the big picture. Sure. Software craftsmanship is really important to me, and also getting to the why. And coming back to working on teams, Russ Cox said at the GopherCon in 2018, software engineering is what happens to programming when you add time and other programmers. So basically, working in a team is, it's a different thing to working on your own. Programming and software engineering are they're not separate things, but software engineering is building structure out of programs. So my career is really focused on, finding out the why people do things the way they do, and trying to make better teams and create better alignment.
So did that lead you to start thinking about the principles that people use when they do software engineering?
Yeah, well, it was actually it was a hard discovery process, and I went to Nokia around 2010 to work. I went to Berlin, Germany, to work for Nokia, and I wasn't well at the time. I had chronic fatigue, which, if you don't know what that is, you don't have a lot of energy, and I also had a lot of brain fog. So I joined a team who I considered were much more capable than me, and that's always been a thing to do. Join a team that you're not quite as good as, and get into that team. And I think I got the job actually not because of my capability, but because my CV was in HTML, and there was a character in there called the mid dot, and I'd used the correct HTML encoding for it. And the person who received my CV was really into typography, so he saw my correct use of mid dot, and he thought, I like this guy because he was into detail. So I think I got that job really because he's like, I can see this guy's really into detail and he really cares about the small things. So yeah, not based on my ability. So I was very happy to join that team. But the problem with joining a team which is much better than you is you don't feel very capable. So I had to very quickly come up with some ways of working that allowed me to perform at the level of the team. And to do that, I got together my old code. I got together and I started making process documents. So when I did things, I started writing down why I did this. And so when I came back to it in the future, when I saw a problem in the future, the problem would be, most of it would be handled with the process documents. But the rest of it would, I could use the rest of my brain to think about the complexity of the problem.
Okay. So you started kind of documenting your own thinking behind the code that you wrote. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, it was the process of how I was working, really. And this, if this happens, do this, or here are the checklists when you're doing this to make sure you get things working right. And that allowed me to work at high levels of complexity. And I didn't know this until later, but the human mind has about 4 slots of memory. This hits about 4 slots of memory, working memory. So in those 4 slots of working memory, you can hold things in your mind. But once that starts filling up with a 5th object, you're kind of moving that around, and you're kind of losing focus on things. It's very hard to be efficient as a human with a human mind. Reducing the complexity by putting things into process, into documents, really helped me get to high levels of complexity. And I don't use complexity in a bad way here. Complexity for me is the ability to work at higher levels. And that enabled me to work on the most complex part of the application. So in the end, I ended up working on the most complex part of the application. My team saw me as very capable, and that gave me a lot of confidence. So I thought, well, if this works when I'm not very well, imagine how well it'll work when I am well, or how it'll work on other people. So that was the point where I was like, I've got something here. I've got something.
Yeah, you're onto something there. Yeah, I can see that. So what happened then?
Well, that's when I joined another team, and I had a lot of confidence at that point. I thought, look, I've got all these amazing documents, all these process documents, and all these ideas. I'm going to tell the team how to do it. I'm going to tell the team how to set up the architecture, and we're going to have this amazing, beautiful architecture. And if you guys out there have ever been your first few steps as a tech and lead, you'll often find that idea of you can go, here's this perfect architecture, and everybody goes, this is amazing, thank you, and everybody follows it, is it almost never happens.
I see.
Yeah, so I found that out quite quickly. I found that my ideas were not really working in the team. The architecture was sound, it was good, but I couldn't communicate it very well to the team. And I was by far the most productive member of that team, but I was hindering my team with my process. They were not able to deliver at the same, and I noticed this and I thought, it was really frustrating for me, because I want teams to be harmonious. I want people to become more capable in teams, and I want us to, to work in alignment, and it wasn't happening. So it didn't go very well. Basically, the first time that I tried to put a bunch of process in the in front of people, it didn't really work. Yeah.
So did that then lead you to start thinking about these processes as principles, to kind of frame them in a different way, or how did that progress?
Yeah, well, I kind of gave up on that idea for a while. I decided to adopt frameworks. I pointed to a framework and said, hey, let's use this framework. And that gave me, I think it's a thing that a lot of software engineers do, a lot of tech leads do. They go, okay, well, I can't build this. I can't use my ideas. Let's just point to this framework like Angular, Redux, Django, that sort of stuff. And it makes the tech lead not responsible as much anymore. They go, well, you can look at this. Here's all the documentation for it. You go off and do it. And it's actually helpful at the beginning, because the team kind of goes, well, I know roughly what I'm doing there. But when you adopt a framework, you're also adopting other people's ideas as well. And in a lot of those frameworks, those ideas aren't obvious. So the starting point of a framework is, oh great, we've got this. Everyone can tell you all the upsides of a framework and no downsides when they start a framework. And the starting point is, I'm gonna start using this. I'm gonna learn this framework, and I'm gonna put things into it. But inevitably, these frameworks are not created to solve your business problem. They're created to solve someone else's business problem, and they built it for their particular business case. So that was that was when I realized that frameworks cause their own problems as well. So what did I do? How did I start aligning them? Well, I didn't for a while. I just gave up. I thought, I spoke to a lot of people and said, hey, how do you align your teams? And everyone goes, framework, or I don't know, or I'm really frustrated, I can't do it.
Okay.
So I kind of gave up for a bit. And then in 2015, I joined McKinsey and Company. So for those that don't know, McKinsey and Company are regarded as the best management consultancy in the world. So they expect a lot out of you. And it's quite an unusual job, because they send you to places for, say, 12 weeks to figure out a task, to perform a task, to build some software, and then move on somewhere else. It's not always like that, but it's very, you're traveling all over Europe. You're interacting with different people from a very high level of business, C-suite level, and you're building things. You're trying to solve people's problems. And I happened to land on one team one time it was amazing. We were aligned. And that was the first time in my career that I was on a team that thought similarly to me. And the experience of that was amazing. I loved coming to work every day. We were talking about, the things that I always wanted to talk about, and they cared about it. And unfortunately, as soon as the team formed, then the team disbanded again, which was the nature of the job.
I see.
So people, so at that point, I was like, okay, there's something there, but what is it? So I was
what was that something that was in that team that inspired you so much?
So it took me a long time to figure it out, and I realized eventually that we had similar backgrounds, and I thought about the backgrounds perspective, and then I realized that most of the things that we do in software engineering is habitual. So an example might be, if you're a junior engineer and you solve a problem for the first time, you might solve it in a particular, you might figure out a way to solve it, and you might repeat that process over and over again until it becomes a habit for you. But if you think about what is a habit or what are automatic behaviors, habits are something that are detached from the logic that created it. So the logic that created it is no longer attached to the habit, and you have this automatic behavior. So you forget the why behind it, and you kind of just have this way of developing, this way of thinking about things. And I realized why it didn't work on the original team. Why did I have problems with that first project? It's because my process documents didn't have much reasoning in them. I was talking about things like, you should structure the code like this, and we should do the architecture like this. And something like architecture is what I would call an emergent behavior. It's an interaction of less complex behaviors to form a more complex behavior. So when someone says to you, here's an architecture, and when I'm talking about architecture, I'm talking about structuring of code. There's a lot of implied knowledge that comes from that person there. And when people couldn't interrogate that knowledge. So an example might be, I would have a very strong desire to set things into small files where I could test the code and test just test the logic behind it. But I couldn't articulate why I wanted to do that. And I'd want to put the test next to it, and I couldn't articulate why I wanted to do that. Whereas looking back, the reason why I wanted to do that was, tests are documentation for me. They provide value. You can look at it. They're interactive documentation because they interact with the code. So it provides a lot of value for people coming into that code base. And also, there are other principles, like you're building a machine in one place, you can test that machine, and you're focusing on one area. Whereas if people don't think like that, they might just take that code and put it in the middle of another larger file. And then you have to test through 5 or 6 different layers of abstraction before you can actually test that bit of core logic that you want to. So I realized that I wasn't giving the reasons to it. Because my behavior was automatic and I thought in a certain way. Other people couldn't interrogate that behavior. And if I couldn't explain really at a deep level why I thought that was the case, then why would anybody listen to me? Why would anybody listen to me? And the people on the team who it wasn't aligned with, it wasn't like they weren't trying. They were absolutely trying to follow these ideas and stuff, but it wasn't working. So people wanted to solve it, but I couldn't explain why they should do it. I couldn't give them enough reasons. So that's really when I realized that the project was kind of born. So the key to successful alignment, in brief, and we'll cover more, I guess, a bit later, is bring those behaviors to the forefront, make those behaviors obvious, and talk about the principles that.
Yeah, and expose, I suppose, the logic that over time got detached from the behavior, as you mentioned.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So you have to talk about the reasons behind it, and that's what principles.dev is all about, helping.
Excellent. Well, that brings us up to speed in terms of the story so far, I think, and it's an excellent opportunity to dig right into that and to ask you about principles.dev then. It sounds like, you had some ideas from working at different companies that you now wanted to kind of share with the world and to share your discoveries with the world. But let me just pass it over to you. So if you could explain, to the people who are just tuning in, who didn't see, for example, the promotional material before, what is principles.dev and how did you, ultimately create it, and what is its purpose?
Yeah, so principles.dev has been a project that's been bugging me for years to start. I've been, Adam, you got to do this, you got to do this. So basically the idea was, or its mission, it was born from the idea of making teams more capable, making software engineering better for everybody by sharing the reasons why we do things, and to get principles from the best in the world at what they do, and to share that knowledge freely. So everyone can look at the behavioral pattern behind things. So for example, imagine if you could see insert favorite programmers' names, insert your favorite programmer's name, how they do things. You're picking up little bits of their capability and adding it to your own. And I think software engineering is a lot about having the right principles. You can get years and years worth of knowledge if you can just organize it in a separate, in the correct way. So, the top 10 principles of using GraphQL, the top 10 principles of database designs, my CTO checklist. There's numerous ways you can slice reality. So I want to bring, because principles on their own are useful, but principles organized by slicing reality is what's really valuable. The ability to take those principles and say, this is contextually useful right now. So principles are more or less useful at different periods of time. And really, it's principles of people who care. And I think if you're watching this, you're the sort of person who cares about this sort of thing. You care about making software engineering better and getting better results out of it. And I think, well, I know that one of the reasons I started this as well was, and a lot of engineers will have experienced this if they're fairly senior, is it keeps people relevant. So if you're a senior engineer and you've been through several cycles of technology, it's a very frustrating process. So you might be using a framework, and you learn that framework, you learn the positives and negatives of that framework, and you're like, okay, I've got it. And you go beyond that framework because you can apply your principles to your ideas and you understand it. And then what happens is another framework comes along and it goes, well, here's a new framework. And everybody's talking about all the good things about this new framework. Like, oh, this framework is the best framework ever. It's going to solve all the problems. And so, well, what's the downside of it? Oh, there's no downside. It's all upside, upside, upside. So the marketing machine kind of works to push people towards these new frameworks. And as a senior engineer, if you've been through this cycle several times, what happens is you have to learn, you have to abandon what you knew before, and you have to adapt to this new framework. And what this new framework is really doing underneath it is saying, adapt all these automatic behaviors, implicit behaviors that we may or may not have explained to you, but you've got to learn again from scratch. Whereas, the difference with a senior engineer for a junior engineer for me is the ability to exist outside of a framework. Really, you have your own principles, you know how to build outside of a framework, and you can use a framework as a tool, whereas a junior developer will want to let's go to this framework, it's the best thing ever. So it's the same with technology choices and things like that. You're just more reasoned about it. And I thought principles.dev is trying to also solve that problem as well, where if you can capture that capability that you learned from using that framework and you can put it in an area that you can refer back to again and again and again, then you can keep on refreshing your capability. So when someone says to you, oh, let's use this new framework, and you go, well, here are the principles that I think we should abide to, and you can start to exist outside of the framework. So instead of having the framework guiding what you should do, you have your own principles framework. So you see the difference. So you've got a framework, but you've got your own principles framework that allows you to exist outside of that framework and to use it as a tool rather than to integrate with it. So
okay. So the way I see it is, I'm a junior engineer, and I'm not a developer myself, so do correct me if I get any of this wrong. But the way I imagine it is, I'm a junior engineer, and I start using a framework because I don't know what else to follow for now. And this framework teaches me a set of principles that are kind of implicit within that framework. Sometimes they're a little bit more explicit, right? Like Django always touts that it's got this batteries included approach, right? And I've never used Django in my life, but I've written enough times about it to know that. So then when I move from out of that framework, let's say Django falls out of popularity, I still have these principles in my mind, and then examining a new framework, I can check the principles within that framework, see how similar or different that is from what I know.
Yes, it is a lot like that, except for a lot of the time the principles aren't explicit. So there are a few frameworks that do that. I know, for example, Redux has 3 principles. I can't remember them exactly. I think it's single source of truth, no state changes, and state changes through reducers. And that's very interesting, because once you know those 3 principles, you can kind of extend the framework. You can kind of, build on top of that framework and extend the framework. Now, you mentioned Django, and Django, there's Django and Flask, right? They're two frameworks
Yeah.
that you can use to develop with. And if you have a lot of principles, and if you have a good way of working, you may decide that you're going to go with Flask, and you're going to use that as a framework you're going to use your own principles for it. With Django has a lot of its own principles. So you might go, well, we're going to use Django for now because that's the one that we really know and we really understand. So and we don't have to, and there's a lot of documentation for it, and it's a great framework to get started with. So I think as you get more advanced, you might decide that you want to go to Flask, but you have to make sure that you've got the right, you're bringing with it the right principles, because people joining that, if they can't see those principles, they can't see that structure, they're not going to be able to develop it as nicely as they might be able to in Django.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, obviously I'm asking my own questions and following my own curiosity here, but dear watchers and listeners, if you have any questions, I'm just reminding you that you can always ask them. Anything you're curious about what Adam is saying, by all means, just go ahead and ask. Meanwhile, I wanted to ask you, so I can kind of see how these principles relate to frameworks, how they can help us examine them, maybe break them apart and pick and choose the principles that we want to follow. Is there anywhere else within how a team functions where principles can be useful, and how can they be applied?
Yeah, well, I really want to cover what is a principle.
Sure, yeah, we probably should start with that.
Yeah, because I think, we've talked a lot about the behavior of principles, but what exactly is a principle? Now, principle, unfortunately, is a slightly overloaded term. If you've come from a different background, you may have a slightly different conception of what a principle is, and there are multiple meanings of it. So it's fine that we might have slightly different meanings of it. But basically, for me, what a principle is, it's a belief, idea, theory, law or rule that's basically a packet of behavior. So it's basically some behavior wrapped up with logic. So it's like a reasoning behind it. So you have little packets of behavior with reasoning behind it. And those, if you've ever played a computer game like an RPG where you level up, it's a little bit like that. If you add more principles to yourself, it's like leveling up your tech skills, because you can go, okay, I've got this new behavior now that I can add this to a new way of thinking about something, and it can completely change the way you approach software engineering. So it's like it's basically little packets of information, of behavior or actions that you can use to make yourself more capable. So there are behavior recipes, and they're really useful for leveling yourself up as a developer. And principles aren't new. They've been around for a long time. People have been talking about them for a long time. But the thing that I really want to get across is principles are contextually useful. That's the value in them. Using them at the right time, using them when they are valuable, and level up your behavior. So attached to, you've got the logic and you've got this behavior, and you can talk to people on your team. You can say, hey, look, this is the thing that I think we should use. And they go, why? And you go, well, look at this principle. This tells you exactly why you should use it. So yeah, it's a really powerful thing. And they're very important.
One thing I'm inferring from what you're saying, sorry to kind of jump in here for a second, is you're saying they're contextual. So is it also part of leveling up your skill as a developer to know when to apply each principle and when maybe to ignore a principle, or is it a different one?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. It's absolutely that. When are principles relevant? That is definitely a skill. And one of the reasons why principles.dev exists is you're able to get these principles. Sorry, there's a lot of background noise coming through. You're able to get these principles and these lists, and create these lists and share those lists. So, for example, if I wanted to go into GraphQL, which I haven't done yet, but if I wanted to do that, wouldn't it be nice if I could go to GraphQL and read the top 10 principles of how to structure GraphQL? I've got all the documentation for it. I can read the documentation fine, but I want to know from some experts how to build up my capability faster. So if I see that, if I can have the opportunity to do that, then I'm gonna upskill myself very, very quickly, because I know these people and I trust these people. So the goal is to get people who are experts in their particular area. So if you're an expert in GraphQL, if you're an expert in Postgres, if you're an expert at low-level machine coding, get them up and to talk about what they think is useful for that particular area. So so people coming to that area for the first time can then...
You cut out for me for a second. Is it on my end or on yours?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear
I'm
me?
going to refresh.
Okay, I'll keep talking. Hopefully you guys can hear me.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, it
Cool.
must have cut out on my end. Sorry, where were we?
Yeah, so we were talking about contextual behaviors and going into principle lists. So yeah, it's a very much, how do you use principles? When is the right time to use principles? That's what needs to be, that's what's going to be community sourcey. But it's for people who are experts in their area, say a top level Django developer talks about the principles then that they're using with their particular their framework. But it's not just using technology, it's how do you interact with teams, and having that behavior talked about from the beginning, or talked about, each team would adopt their own principles. It's not to say there are best principles. Some team might adopt a certain set of principles and other teams will adopt a different set of principles. As long as they're aligned, it's more important to be aligned than to have 100% the correct principles. The alignment, working in a team is more important than that. So yeah,
that sounds very quotable. It's more important to be aligned than to have 100% correct principles. That's that's definitely something to remember from this session. So just boiling it down to what principles dev is in its kind of form, so that people can have an idea if they haven't opened it in a second window yet. Would it be fair to say that it's a catalog of principles that you can pick and choose, or would you describe it differently?
It is the technical way I'd describe it is it's a way to slice reality. And what I mean by that is however reality works for you. So you might think about it as a set of principles you might use in code review, a set of principles you might use in an early stage of a project. You might think about it as your favorite principles, so it's really about the community coming up with the the ideas, and that's okay. That's okay to have lots of different principles and lots of different ideas. And if you look on the website at the moment, because it got on HackerNews and because I'm doing this, the website is in its early phases, but it's absolutely looking to create more contributors. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be contacting a lot of people and say, hey guys, I really like your principles. Can you put them on the website? And getting those people to organize them so people can see how people are building software. So.
Okay, so anybody listening to this who is a high-level software engineer or a tech lead, if they have some principles that they follow, they should visit and they should leave them on principles.dev too, right? To start building that database.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'll happily help as well, talk about them. And I think the thing about principles is once you start writing them, you really learn what you believe about your own software engineering skills. And I've been through this process many times. I come up with a principal idea, I start writing it down, and I go, oh, actually, that isn't right. That doesn't make sense. It's not. This logic doesn't make sense. So you learn about a lot about your own software engineering practices by writing your own principles out.
Yeah, exactly. So I encourage everybody watching and listening to this session to do that. Meanwhile, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the specifics, and I wanted to ask you if there are any specific principles that you follow that are favorites of yours, and what is the reasoning behind them. We should definitely cover the logic behind the behavior. So do you have any particular principles that you adhere to?
Yes. The principle that founded this website was something that I call make the invisible visible. And what that's about is making relevant information that is currently hidden visible to other people. And that's kind of like my founding principle. That's how I conduct my life with this. This is what I'm all about in software engineering. So that's a very, very important principle to me, and but it's a high level principle, right? It's like, I can take this everywhere with me and I can do it through teams, but it's not super focused. Some of the other principles.
Before we get to that, I wanted to ask about the logic behind the principle then. If you want to make the invisible visible, what is the reasoning behind it? What is the benefit behind that?
Yeah, so making the invisible visible, it would be easiest if I could just look at the website and get it up, but obviously I'm not going to do that right now.
Okay.
It's about revealing things so that people can see them, because it allows for more productive teams. It allows for people to interrogate behavior. It allows them to see something that I call abstract space. It allows them to see, to communicate in things. And if you can see things, you can interrogate things. If I can see the way I do something or understand the way that I do something, you can interrogate it. Whereas if you have a lot of hidden behavior, you can't see that. You can't see what's going on.
Right.
And I mentioned abstract space, and this is really what I think software engineering is all about, or where it happens. So abstract space is a three-dimensional reality that exists in the mind and the mind of others, that comes together to build up a picture of what the abstract entity you're building. So in software engineering, that's the bit of code that you're building. That's the bit of the structure you're building, because source code on its own is flat. It doesn't show you, there's 2D lines of text. It doesn't show you what's happening in a software system. It doesn't show you what's going through the what's happening at any moment. So the way I think about software engineering is a little bit like a construction site, except for when you walk onto this construction site, the lights are completely off. You can't see anything that's going on, and you kind of have to feel your way around the system. Feel a way around this construction site, and you're kind of feeling the posts around it, and you're making a mental image. And it takes a long time to form a full picture of what that software engineer, that system is like. And a lot of time you never do it, but principles are like the light that shines upon that. So you can, that light that makes things obvious to you, because if you understand the behavior or the logic and the reasoning behind why something is happening, you'll start to see the pillar that you're feeling, or you might see some of the flaw or some of the structure in place, because you understand why things are occurring. So principles are, and that's coming back to making the invisible visible. It's like the principles are like that. They're like shining lights on the source code or on the structure to make it more visible for other people to follow and understand. So
that puts a very vivid mental image in my mind. So that's quite memorable. And you mentioned other principles that you wanted to get into. Sorry that I stopped you for just a second there, but definitely do get into any others that might be, useful for you, have served you well in the past, you would recommend others try out.
Yeah, as I said, a lot of principles are contextually useful, but one of the ones that I use very often is it's called separating core logic from the framework. So basically what it's saying is, if I have a framework, don't put everything inside that framework. And the analogy I use for that is, if you put everything inside the framework, it's a little bit about building everything in a house. So you put all your logic in the framework, all the valuable code in the framework. It's a little bit like filling the house with loads of your items and then nailing those items down to that house. That's all attached and embedded in that house. But if you move on to a new framework, you have to throw away everything, because you've moved on to another framework and you've lost all that capability. All you have is your memory from it. So if you move that away from the framework, you're building this value outside of the framework. The framework's a tool, but the business value, something that has longevity and something that you can build with your own principles framework, is being built. So that's a really important one for me on teams, because I'm like, well, let's we're beyond this using just frameworks and integrating everything into it. Let's use the framework as a tool to enable more to enable code that lasts for a long time, and also enables us to bring our own principles into it, because you feel more comfortable. And with a framework without principles, it takes you a long time to learn it. But if you have your own principles and the team shares those principles, you start moving quite quickly. You feel familiar with it. It's a nice feeling, basically. So that's a very important one for me on teams.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you on the flip side, because these two, can I think be very useful. And if any of you watchers and listeners want to explore more, there's a website for that now. But I wanted to also ask: are there any principles that you might particularly disagree with that don't usually serve you well? If you could talk about that.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as they are. I don't have any strong principles that I disagree with, but there are principles that are perhaps outdated or principles that I wouldn't use at certain times. So there's a principle called the Liskov substitution principle, and that's you may have heard of this before. It's in the solid principles of object-oriented design, and it's about being able to replace a superclass with a subclass, and that the system still function the same way, or still be able to function. And I think it's what I would call an outdated principle, because a lot of people don't use inheritance like that anymore. So it's kind of like, it's a principle that was valuable back then, but if you're not using software engineering with a lot of inheritance in it, it's probably not that valuable. But also as well, it's named really triggily, and it's actually really hard to get the meaning of it. If you come to it for the first time, you're like, what is this Liskov substitution principle?
Right.
I wonder if it was just they needed an L in the solid principles. They needed that letter, but it was it's a principle that I think is probably outdated now. So that's it. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering, were there any others that... Oh, well, one question that I do have that I'm curious about is, you might disagree with this principle, but you will be, correct me if I'm wrong, you'll be okay putting that principle on principles.dev for others to explore, agree or disagree with.
Absolutely. I actually want people to put principles that I don't think or I don't understand yet, because if the test would be to put a principle on there and I go, yeah, I can see that makes sense. That is something that is really valuable for me, because I get to learn something from it and the community gets to learn from it. It's not about me deciding what are the best principles. Eventually there'll be a voting system on the website that will allow people to upvote and the principles that are most valuable, but I kind of want it to be an evolution. Like, let's just get those principles on the website. Let's see what the community finds valuable. And what will happen as well, once you've put the software engineering principles as well, you might come back to it again and again and again. If once you've put it on there, you can keep on editing it, right? You can keep on changing it and making it better. And I do that very often. I come back to my thought process and I go, yeah, I need to refine this. I need to make this clearer. And you'll find that, the principles really enable you to become a better developer, or a better engineer or a better leader, because you're following this. You're really breaking apart your thought process, and you're attaching your logic and reasoning to those automatic behaviors, which you can then use to be more convincing for other people. And yeah.
Right. So that's something that I also wanted to follow up on is, you mentioned a lot of the benefits behind using principles and how they help engineering teams. I was wondering if you could expand on that, and also to talk a little bit about the how of it all. There might be people watching this who are convinced by what you've said. And then how do they start applying it to their day-to-day work? What do they put on their to-do list? Do they start a sheet? Do they start a doc? So if you could talk about both the why and the how to start closing up the session, I think it would be useful.
Yeah. So the how, a team, basically, principles build alignment and capability, so you can build better software. And what that means is you have more fun teams, more productive teams. You're delivering an organizational goal. You are producing more, and everybody's happier. And so that harmony brings happiness to the team. So principles help do that. And if you think about another team, I mentioned the idea of abstract space, two people having different structures in their mind, different conceptions of what a code base looks like. If you imagine one person might look at the code base and I might see two rooms with a connecting pipe between it, talking about the construction analogy again. So I might see that two separate rooms with a pipe between it. So there's a communication path happening between with that pipe. Somebody else might just see that as one room. And if that person sees it as one room, how are they going to go on the code base? And if you guys have been on a software engineering team before, there's always somebody on the team who just go straight through that structure. They don't see the structure that exists in place, so they go through the code base and they just cause it to pull these dependencies in for everyone. You're like, oh no, there's structure here, and you've completely violated it. So having alignment through principles, it starts, you're creating pictures in people's minds. An analogy for an aligned team versus an unaligned team is, or an organization, I call it the swamp versus skyscraper. So a swamp represents a lack of solid foundations, and you're building up if you're an unaligned organization, you're building up houses on top of this swamp. You're building up all these little structures on this swamp, and you are connecting with wires and pipes and things like that. And you're just building. There's no alignment. You're just building. And as the organization gets bigger and bigger, this lack of alignment is causing much more complexity. You might build a house really far away, and then you've got a pipe that's coming, that's going 2 miles now. You just need a whole different system to get it working. It becomes unmanageable, and the houses all look different and they don't really work together. Whereas an aligned organization is a little bit more like a skyscraper. A skyscraper, you build in the trunking, so you have the power conduits going through the central atrium, you have the lifts working, you have the networking cable and the waterworks all defined, and you're building in modularly so that the organization is working together and fitting things together. And that's the difference between, you can build something much more complex, and I use complex in a good way again, is, you can get to a high level of complexity because you can manage that complexity, because you know how you're aligned. So it's basically, principles also make software last a long time. So yeah, but how can you use principles to make things better? Well, there's lots of ways, but probably some of the most important ways are finding alignment from the very beginning, and that is bring it into the code interview process. How do people think? If you think about what a principle is, why do people choose principles? Well, it's automatic behavior, but it's also based fundamentally on what they think on a much lower level. But the great thing about principles is, if people align on principles, that's high-level behavior that people can interrogate. So if I say separate core logic from a framework, and they're like, "Yep, I agree with that," you're going to come to an alignment straight away with how you'll build a team. So start it at the interview process. Talk about it in code reviews. Code reviews are quite useful, but if you can point them to principles while you're doing this, saying this is how, just copy paste a link to the principle, to go, oh yeah, okay, this is the thing that I'm violating, rather than spending time. You can use it to bring it to your team and create rationale. You can help people understand why things are done in a certain way, and you can bring alignment to the team by putting your interrogatable behavior, this is the reason I believe this is why I believe this, to the team, so that they can go, oh yeah, I get it now. And it's very effective. It's a very effective way of working, because you can see where the alignment is happening when it isn't happening, and that's why it's also quite important to do it at the very beginning of the process, the interview process. Do you think, it's not to say you should think exactly like me, because you want a mixture of people on the team, but it's, do you fundamentally agree with me? Are you fundamentally going to get on with me? That is very important to a team, and is probably one of the most valuable things you can do with your team, because that is going to make your team better. And just to finish off on that one, also capture your principles as you're going through the process. Build up those principles, write them in a principle list, and say, here are the principles of our team. So when someone comes to the code base for the first time, they've got those flashlights that they can go around with and bring on board to their mental process, and start to understand what's going on in that code base much quicker and feel much more confident in that code base. So it's basically creating an asset for the long-term future, rather than just something that's gone when the team disappears.
Right. Yeah. The logic behind this, I think, is very sound, because it shows new people coming in, not just what was built, but why it was built the way it was built. I can also imagine it can do wonders for your authority as a leader, where you can it makes your team members feel that you are a lot more consistent as a leader, because it's not just individual feedback sessions where you point out these principles, but they are actually written somewhere. The logic behind them is spelled out. They can interrogate that. If you want to have a conversation, it's not a conversation me versus you and what we think. It's about this principle, and do we agree
Yeah.
with it? Should we modify it? Should we switch it out? Right?
Well, it does make you more. It does make you a better leader, but it also makes you more vulnerable as a leader. And it's something to think about. It's what you're saying is, here's what I believe. Here's what I believe about. And someone can go to you and go, "This is stupid," and then you go, "Okay, well, tell me why you think it's stupid." And having those honest conversations, hearing that about what you think is not a nice thing, but that honesty helps you get to alignment quicker. So it's like, yeah, you could be the engineer, which I was, which is like, do everything my way. At the beginning, which do everything my way. This is great. This is perfect. If you don't do it my way, it's just this is the best way of doing it. Whereas if you start going to teams, say, okay, well, look, this is the way I believe we should do things. You're enabling your team to become more capable. You're enabling them to have those questions about the team and to see what's going on. You're making the invisible visible, so you're not hiding behind.
Right.
As we always feel, people want to feel like they're smart, especially in software engineering. They don't like to admit they're wrong. And this adds some vulnerability to it. But I say that the vulnerability is actually valuable. It aligns team, it brings people together, and it makes software engineering better for everybody, which is really what Principles is all about.
Yeah, you mentioned it makes you more vulnerable, but like you mentioned, that complexity doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think this is also the kind of vulnerability that is also not exactly bad. It can be powerful to open your thinking up like that to your team, so that they can. I think you can only build trust and alignment, like you said, when it's out in the open, and everybody can explore your thinking behind it. Although I suppose you should also just brace for the fact that sometimes your team is going to be more right than you are, and they're going to propose a change that makes sense.
And that's great, isn't it? Because they could be more capable. Like on a team, you're going to have people who are more capable in different areas. So someone might be really strong with SQL, so you're kind of relying on their abilities rather than as a tech lead. Tech leads sometimes conceived as someone who should know everything. And has to be the person who knows about everything. But that's not true. They're the person who can help bring the team to alignment and make sure the team is, you should be hiring people who are better at you than certain things, like SQL or JavaScript or whatever. Why would you hire someone if they're not better than you? Because then you're creating a much more capable team. So it's about being able to bring the team together with those principles and being honest about it.
True, yeah. Okay, so I wanted to just make one last note. This is the last call for questions for Adam, if you have any. So be sure to drop them in the comments section, either on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, because we're all on all three channels. We're closing in on the 1 hour mark, so I would like to be, I could talk, right? But to respect your time and our viewers' time, we'll be wrapping up just, slowly. But I did want to ask you, to try and sum up everything that we've covered. Let's say that I am a tech lead and I have these issues. So I'm looking at my team and there's lack of alignment. There's this invisible wall that is making communication more difficult because people have different principles in their heads. Let's say I'm in the thick of it, okay, and I have this problem. What would you recommend as the first practical step to start fixing this problem? Is it a meeting? Is it a doc? Is it something else?
Yeah, so when I go onto Teams, one of the first things that I do is to try and find a principle that generally everybody agrees with. So one of those principles is consistent code conventions automatically enforced. So that might be using, if you're in JavaScript, JSLint, Python, I can't remember, Black, or there's loads of different linters, and just talk about that and say, hey, look, here's a principle that we're going to start with. And what you've got, you get people and you go, I agree with that principle. You talk about it, the reasons for it, and you start getting alignment on that. And you start introducing them to the process of using principles on your team. And from that point, it's about making and adding another principle. You go, okay, well, what about this thing? And you start to think about how you set up your project, how you start creating your own principle lists, and you start saying, okay, well, this is what we agreed to. And so when it comes to a code review, you might go, instead of writing 2 paragraphs worth of text, copy paste the principle. Say, look, this is violating this principle for me. Have a look at it. Tell me what you think. So you're starting to get it. You're starting to show people to think about it and to start people questioning their own automatic behaviors. You really have to get people to question their automatic behaviors and to start to see them as automatic behaviors. Like people will argue about things until they're blue in their face about 2 spaces, 4 spaces. You have to try and find out the why behind that and encourage people to find out the why they think that. And if you start coming with principles, you start saying to people, actually, guys, I care about why you think about it. You just have to explain, you just have to be able to articulate that properly. And then that gets people to be very self-reflective and to start to think about their processes and the way that they do things. So that would be the first practical step, is to start with a small principle and get alignment on that. So you've got one principle that you can align on, and then you can start building from there.
Yeah, and what I can also infer is write it down, right? Actually have it written somewhere in your company, documents or your team documents.
Yeah, you can use principles.dev for that. You can create a list for my team and start putting principles in there as well, so you can start capturing those principles on the website.
Exactly. Yeah, that is absolutely a practical takeaway from this. And like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of what you were saying, as you were saying it, I was thinking, well, this applies to so much more than just code. And when I'm thinking about myself, my team, we don't write code, we write content, but there's also principles behind the different decisions of how we structure our content. And that also could bear some writing down, now that I think about it, which just makes it a typical Tech Leaders Hub session. I also learned myself a lot.
You're absolutely right. Principles are not just software engineering based. I think the thing about software engineering is it's very focused on, it's so abstract and things are so invisible that I really want to focus on that area. But there's absolutely principles apply everywhere. It's making the invisible visible within your organization so you can understand the why behind things and the logic behind decisions. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all the more important that we had this hour to talk about this, and we're just past the 1 hour mark. So I wanted to leave also, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you just for making it here, for sharing what you know, and for sharing your story and your principles as well, and your thinking behind it. I wanted to ask you, as is tradition on Tech Leaders Hub, do you have any announcements for our audience? Programmers are listening to this, tech leaders are listening. What would you like to tell them?
Yeah, so the project Principles.dev is a community project. It's not about me. I'm here to facilitate making software engineering better for everybody. So if something I said today has kind of hit a chord with you, I'd love to chat to you. You can reach me on email. We can have face-to-face, or you can submit principles and I can help you through that process. And it's if you're getting in now, you're actually going to start creating something that's going to be very valuable for people in the future, because the people who are putting in the first principles, those principles are going to be used for people much further down the line. It's kind of the first mover advantage, really. It's like, here are my principles, and it's like, yeah, you become the thought leader of that particular principles. You can, if you want to keep up, follow me at principles_dev. You can find that link on the website as well, which I talk about principles more and keep up with the project. And I would love to hear, I'd love to talk to you more if you are like, yes, Adam, I get this. I know what you're talking about. Thank goodness someone's talking about this. Let's have a chat, and I'm more than happy to speak to you. So.
That is excellent, and I bet there's at least a few people saying thank goodness that somebody talked about this. I would be remiss not to also say a few words about SDX Next, because people might be tuning into Tech Leaders Hub for the first time. On the other hand, if you have a problem of a different nature, in the sense that you're a tech leader and you're building a product, you're thinking of building a product, you're thinking of building a startup, and you would like some help with defining what you want to build, designing it, then developing it, maybe deploying it, debugging it, all of those things we can help with, especially if your tech stack is in Python and JavaScript. Django and Flask were mentioned today. We have expertise in that. So if anybody here is watching and would like to explore that, sdxnext.com. But I don't want to spend too much time being self-promotional, so that's as much as I'm going to say. And I'm going to thank you again, Adam, for making it to Tech Leaders Hub. You've been a wonderful guest, and it was a very stimulating conversation. So thank you so much for that.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. That'll be all for today, everyone. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn to get more Tech Leaders Hub. You can also join the Tech Leaders Hub group on Facebook. You can also subscribe on YouTube. We're on Twitter. We're basically everywhere except TikTok. So you can look for us there. TikTok is not in our immediate future, but who knows? Looking at it from a year's perspective, I might be saying, why didn't we get into TikTok sooner? Anyway, enough rambling from me. Thank you again, Adam. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time. And I'm going to click end broadcast now.